Hey, true crime fans! Tired of ads interrupting your gripping investigations? Good news! With Amazon Music, you have access to the largest catalog of ad-free top podcasts included with your Prime membership. After all, ads shouldn't be the scariest thing about true crime. To start listening, download the Amazon Music app for free or go to amazon.com/ad-free true crime. That's amazon.com/ad-free true crime to catch up on the latest episodes without the ads.
Odoo is business management made so simple, a kid could explain it.
Sometimes business software can't talk to other programs. But Odoo, funny word, has every program from CRM to HR to accounting in one platform. It should cost a lot, but it doesn't. So you should use Odoo because they save you money.
Odoo makes a lot of sense, but doesn't cost a lot of sense. Sign up now at odoo.com.
That's ODOO.com.
Good job.
Thanks.
Hello and welcome to 31 Days of Terror, day number 27, and you know the drill at this stage. It is a Tim episode, and for today's episode I'm joined by the wonderful Tim Cloke. Tim is a regular on Patreon. He has been the co-host on multiple main episodes at this stage. He is an avid historian and all-round good guy, and today he's bringing us more terrifying tales, and today's episode is all about battlefield hauntings. You can follow Tim on YouTube at Mr. Cloke History and on Instagram at Dry Wipe History. The links to his YouTube and Instagram will be in the description of this episode. And this episode was recorded remotely, so the sound quality may be a little bit different to what you are used to. And I am joined in the virtual studio by the wonderful, the stunning, the flirtatious.
Okay, these are getting more ridiculous every time we do them.
I don't know why I said flirtatious.
Nor do I. I've got a funny feeling it's going to be kept, though, isn't it?
Yes, but I'm going to keep it in. I was just saying to Tim that I've recorded a lot of episodes today, and I'm a bit like jumbly and all over the place. Hence flirtatious. But there you are, Tim. That's your reputation from now on. But I'm joined by the wonderful Tim Cloke.
I feel like I should answer like Terry Thomas or something like that. Hello. And
yes, there you go. And people would be like, my God, yes, stunning. Consider me flirted. Tim, it's wonderful to have you back in the virtual studio. It is our last Tim Cloke episode of this round of 31 Days of Terror.
It is. I think it's gone really quickly. I mean, we don't think there's many times we've recorded this many episodes in quite such quick succession. So yeah, it's been a wonderful ride. Thanks for having me along on it.
No, we've been pretty like machines doing this, getting these episodes done. Thank you for taking the time to do them. I just want to reiterate to people that are listening, Tim is a full-time teacher, head of department. He works and does a lot of shit himself. And then I say, come on and let's take up your evening and record this episode. So I'm very grateful for you doing that. Thank you.
I mean, generally, I've been talking history all day as well, so it's like putting on a comfortable pair of shoes, I could say. Although, I must say, I'm feeling a lot better this time. I maybe didn't quite let on just how utterly ill I was on the last recording. I'm really nervous it would have come out with me sounding absolutely dreadful. But, you know, I think it went very well. So I'm hoping that, being that I'm much more fighting fit tonight, then we will get on very well. And perhaps fighting fit is a really good description for what I need to be for this particular episode.
Oh, I'm excited about this one because, like I've said, I've had tons of requests for this and I've just never touched it. I've been like, oh no, I'm afraid, because I don't have that history background to know all the ins and outs and details of these different battles and battleground ghosts. So I'm putting it into your hands, Tim.
This is very much my wheelhouse, and I'm going to get on with it. That's the impression I've been given anyway. Mind you, before we get into that, talking about fighting fit, congratulations on the half marathon. It's such a big thing, and I think anyone who's never done it, they're always incredibly impressed by it. But until you have actually done it, you don't quite realise what you've done. So, yeah, massive congratulations to you. And it's the first of many, let's be honest.
Yes. So that's number one down. Number two is in a couple of days. I will say, I'm not going to go on about it too much, but I have been horribly smug about it. Like I was in my acting class the other day and covered in deep heat patches because I was aching so much, and everybody was flinging themselves around doing some exercise, and it came to my turn, and I was like, oh, sorry, I am going to be taking this very slow and easy. No, I'm just a bit injured. No, I'm fine. I'm just a bit injured.
Yeah.
Literally waiting for somebody to be like, why are you injured? So I could go, oh no, just ran a half marathon at the weekend.
Just going to shops to pay for stuff and getting your bag out. Oh, I've just got this medal in here. I'll just get
just wearing it around.
I mean, she's wearing it right now, listeners. I mean, you can believe that or not. It's I do totally get it though. The day after I did the London Marathon, I just had it in my pocket all day. Not necessarily so I could just show anyone, but just so I could kind of pat my pocket and go, oh, I've earned that.
After the London Marathon this year, I don't know where I was, somewhere in Kent going for lunch. It was the next day and there was a woman walking around wearing her medal. And I was like, you fucking go, girl. Because honestly, I'm just going to say this now, right? I will never run a marathon. I have no interest in doing it. The thought, when I got to that 21 kilometers, when I got to that, that 13 miles, I was thinking about you. I was thinking about Ben, your friend, my friend, Sinead's husband. I was thinking about like anybody else who I know, like I know somebody who's run an ultra recently. The thought of getting to 21 kilometers and being like, I am now only halfway.
I'm just going to go and do that again.
You couldn't, if you had said to me, there is £1 million at the end of 42 kilometers, I would not have been able to drag myself like another 21 kilometers. It just wouldn't have happened. I don't know how you did it. I don't know how people do it. It's incredible. Pretty crazy.
Well, I can tell you this much because I think actually you deserve all the credit. The first time I ran a half marathon, I felt exactly the same as you. I just thought, I don't know how anyone just sets off and does that again immediately from this point.
It's mental.
And yet they do. And I'm going to say for you, never say never. Because you're going to do 7 half marathons. You might think, right, what's next? But obviously no pressure there. But never say never. And I would say, listeners, if you are able to, just throw all the money in the world that you can at Emma. It's she's raising money for British Heart Foundation, and they do such fantastic work. And it'd be a wonderful way of recognising her hard work. Because, my word, I follow you on Strava. I see the effort you've been putting into this, and I know how much you hate it. So, I mean, hats off to you.
That's it.
That's just it.
Because the British Heart Foundation are doing an article about Dan because they're keen on raising awareness about how actually young people can be really affected by heart conditions and can die from heart conditions, and that it's really important to raise money for research, blah, 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 right? So they were on the phone to me the other day and they were putting together this article and getting information from me and blah, blah, blah. And the guy was like, why did you choose running? Like, do you really love it? And I was like, no, I was literally like, I hate this so much. So this is the worst thing I've ever done. I step foot outside that door, whether it's 5K or 15K or 21K. And I hate it equally. I hate, I'm like, this is the worst thing that's ever happened to me. Why am I doing this? Like, this is terrible. So, if you think that I'm out there having a good time and loving it, I'm not. So I find it really difficult if that's not incentive to donate money.
If that doesn't get you to open your wallet, I don't know what will.
But yes, Tim, thank you. That is very lovely of you to congratulate me on it. I probably will be feeling very miserable on Sunday when I have to do it again, but then I'm not doing another one until March, so I'll be hibernating until then.
Yeah, and you can think about all the nice, cool, and shall we say, easier runs you got between now and then.
Yes. Absolutely.
You mentioned sorry, I cut across you there. I was just going to say, you mentioned about an ultra marathon. I want you to bear that in mind, actually, with the very first of the stories that we're going to have today, because there is a certain amount of long distance running involved with that one there.
Could you be bothered? Imagine you're living back in the day and somebody's like, run there with this message.
They're not wearing modern running shoes or anything else. Oh, it's hard going.
They're not eating Percy pigs on the way. Do you know what I mean?
I mean, put it this way, Percy pigs don't appear in the archaeological record for any of these battles. I'm not saying that it didn't happen, but I think it's unlikely. But essentially the format that I'm going to go for today is I'm going to tell a historical tale of what happened during the battle. That's always my way, isn't it? I give a bit of historical context and then we get into the ghost stories. But unlike my other recent episodes, this one is very much more conventionally, here's the history and here are the ghost stories that are attached to this site or to this tale. And I've chosen 4 battles that I think they're from different time periods, so they are very different battles, but the ghost stories attached to them are very different. So I'm hoping this will be a nice varied listen. And if people really like it, please do let us know, because there are so many battlefield ghost stories. I might even be able to do some more if people do like it. If you don't like it, tell me and I'll take that on board. Or not. That's fine.
Just shush if you don't like it. Our collective egos can't handle it, okay?
Yeah, I think that's probably fairer. So shall I get into our first battlefield ghost story?
Oh yes, please do. I'm very excited to hear it. Let's get into it.
All right, I go a bit rogue at times during this story, so be ready. As dawn broke, exhausted lines of infantry lined the top of the hill in the land of the South Saxons. They had good reason to be exhausted. Their homeland, denied a peaceful succession by their pious and recently deceased king, Edward the Confessor, had been invaded not once, but twice in just a few weeks. The armies of Harold Godwinson, the proclaimed King of England, had crushed the forces of the Norse king Hardrada at Stamford Bridge after a punishing 180-mile forced march up the Great North Road. This was achieved in only 4 days. But this victory had come at a price. 5,000 of Godwinson's best thanes and huscarls, who could not be retrained and regrown for a generation, had perished in their obliteration of the Viking army. Just as they had tasted victory, the worst possible news arrived. While they had gambled in abandoning England's southern shores to parry the Viking assault in the north, another threat had landed at the old Roman fort at Pevensey, far to the south. The ambitious Duke of the Normans, William the Bastard, had landed and proceeded to raze the countryside, a calculated savagery designed to provoke King Harold into an attack before his forces could be reconsolidated. The strategy worked, and Harold hurried to face his enemy. As the 14th of October 1066 dawned, 2 armies faced each other. The Saxon shield wall of King Harold, braced at the top of Senlac Hill, and William's archers, infantry and cavalry, arrayed at the marshy base of the slope. Within hours, the entire trajectory of English history would be rocked off its axis, never to be the same again. The sources, such as they exist, seem to agree that this fight was a close-run thing. William had tried to smash through the shield wall repeatedly without success. Archers rained arrows down upon the Saxon ranks, but their broad shields and the advantage of the hill rendered the arrows impotent against the massed infantry. Mail-clad sergeants and dismounted knights hurled themselves up the hill, only to break like waves on a shore as the English overlapped their shields, braced themselves, and held firm. Cavalry dashed towards the defenders, only for their war steeds to shy away. And shy away they might, at the line of shields bristling with glinting spears and the whistling sweep of 2-handed axes, capable of beheading a horse in one swipe. The bastard Duke of Normandy had raised the stakes by destroying or dismissing his invasion fleet of 700 ships. His men knew that there was no retreat from where they stood. It seemed at first that William's invasion would fail in the mud, blood and filth of the battle on Senlac Hill, 6 miles inland from the fishing village of Hastings. William had horses killed beneath him by the thrust of spears and the whirl of Dane axes. He had to mount replacements and lift his helmet to show his men that he yet lived, imploring them to keep up the assault. Despite the lack of a breakthrough, hours of bloody combat had thinned the English ranks, and their remaining experienced men, and increasingly the ill-disciplined part-time peasant third, were taking their place. Then came the moment of greatest peril for William. A dangerous rumour spread through their Breton allies that the Duke had been slain. This false news rippled through the terrified soldiers, who first shrank back and then turned in disorder and retreat. The Saxon right flank, lacking cohesion and believing that they were on the point of victory, gave chase. It was a fatal error. Finally given the room to manoeuvre, the Norman knights on their horses could wheel behind them and cut them down as they stood, isolated and bereft of the shelter of their comrades' shields. William was cunning, seasoning upon this newfound momentum. He ordered a series of feigned retreats that tempted more unwise Saxons into giving chase. This ruse de guerre gnawed away at the Saxon lines until King Harold himself was fighting valiantly, shoulder to shoulder with his men. The battle had raged for a then inconceivable 9 hours. the slopes of Senlac Hill now slick with blood, excrement, and filth. By the end, few still standing in the depleted shield wall had the strength to haul their shields aloft in defiance of the Norman archers. And so, as a hail of arrows and crossbow bolts, loosed high and low in the same volley, fell upon the English, sources suggest that Harold was struck in the eye. Norman knights set about the body of the king and so mutilated him that Harold's wife, Edith the Swan-necked, could only identify him based on markings found on his corpse, marks that could only have been discerned with the intimacy of a lover's knowledge. The tattered remnant of the English nobility might well have asked in the old tongue of the English, Where quam mea, where quam meo, where quam methungeva, where quam simble yesetu, where sindon selodremas, eola beatbuna, eola brinuiga, eola theodnes frem, who sea thraidjawat, ye nap under nithelm, swa heo nowhere. Where is the horse? Where is the rider? Where is the giver of treasure? Where are the benches at the table? Where is the joy of the hall? Alas for the bright goblet! Alas for the mailed warrior! Alas for the pride of princes! How their time is passed away under the helm of night, as if it had never been. England's entire aristocracy and much of its political system was upended in a matter of a few short months from that fateful clash on October the 14th, 1066. This makes the Battle of Hastings one of the most consequential battles in the bloody history of the British Isles. The bastard Duke had, soaked in the grime of combat, been made a king and a conqueror. The echoes of the clashing steel at Hastings may be heard in the English language, its place names, and even in contemporary power. Perhaps 1/5 of England remains owned by the descendants of those who fought for William on Senlac Hill. But such spilling of blood appalled even those who lived in the brutal times of the 11th century. Having secured the Pope's blessing to unseat Harold, an accused oathbreaker, William wanted to do penance for the gouts of blood he had spilt. He established an abbey with its high altar placed on the spot where Harold had fallen. It, and the town that grew up beyond the boundary, became known simply as Battle. Where battlefields may retain the imprint of the violence and the souls of those who fought there, at the town and abbey of Battle, this is combined with long centuries of ecclesiastical occupation. Phantom soldiers and monks on one and the same site? Indeed, for this is what Battle Abbey may offer the intrepid ghost hunter, if the stories are to be believed. So what do you know about the Battle of Hastings?
Oh, very little, only that it was fairly ropey. Like it wasn't great. And now I know loads about it, right?
Yeah,
because I just heard about it. So they're marching for 180 miles, right, in 4 days.
So that's to get north to fight the Vikings for the first battle.
They're having a scrap with the Vikings up north, right?
Yeah.
And then they get a phone call and they're like, Jesus, William the Bastard has just landed down south and he's raising the place. You got to get down here quick. So they march back. Mm. They have like their peasant kind of standby army ready to go, right?
They're known as the third. So they are literally 1 or 2 men from every 100 or kind of part of the Shire would have to send a man with weapons funded by the local peasantry. They
march back and they're having this scrap for 9 days.
For 9 hours.
9 hours, not 9 days. For 9 hours.
But by the standards of the day, most battles were settled in an hour or two. 9 hours is a long time for this period in history.
And I've said this to you before, like there's a version of Macbeth with Michael Fassbender and that French woman whose name I can never remember. I don't particularly like the film, but the one thing that it does do is show how fucking horrific war was. Like it was just a load of fellas kicking the shit out of each other in a field. Like you're not talking about like, guns. And I know that sounds really stupid, but when you think about what it actually means to be physically fighting for that length of time for 9 hours, the sheer brutality of it doesn't even bear thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, it's just utterly terrifying. I mean, you say, obviously, as a joke, they got the phone call when they're up north. It wouldn't have taken much longer than that. Piecing together what we know, they seem to have set up a really sophisticated system of fire beacons, like that scene in Lord of the Rings in that scene. The unfortunate thing for the English, I mean, there were competing claims to the throw, which I won't all go into now because it isn't a history podcast, but there had been one battle in the north at a place called Gate Fulford, which is just south of York, and the English earls who had faced the Vikings there had been defeated. And so it seemed that the message had got to Harold, obviously by one of these fire beacons, which kind of only really represented a binary message of the Vikings are here, or if they're not lit, the Vikings aren't here.
Yeah.
That clearly things weren't in hand up north, and so he needed to abandon his southern defences. And not only would history be very different, but our memory of King Harold would be so different had he only had to fight the Battle of Stamford Bridge up north, which was a tremendously bloody battle. In terms of deaths, it was bigger probably than Hastings. And just as they've got that victory and they think, oh, thank goodness we've succeeded, we've saved the kingdom for another season, because it's right at the end of the medieval campaigning season, this, before the weather gets too bad to be moving armies through the countryside, they get another message, probably again from these fire beacons saying, oh dear, Duke William has arrived in the south, you're needed back here. And Duke William would not have understood at all why Harold was not there unless he'd been tipped off. There is a suggestion by some historians
that maybe he knew.
That William knew. I mean, the old story goes that William was just very lucky that the wind changed at the right time and that got him across the ocean. And that might be true. But equally, he might have been tipped off by his spies. And it is said that as he stepped off the ship, he fell onto the sand and everyone thought, whoa, this is a bad omen. And then just sort of said something along the lines of, look how keen I am to grasp this England, holding the sand in his hands.
I mean, that's what you call styling it out.
The guy's got style. He otherwise absolutely lives up to his name, William the Bastard. He really does. And I can say that. He's my 37th great-grandfather. I discovered that through my own research. And actually, for people who share similar ancestry to most people in Northern Europe, he probably is yours as well, because it's that long ago. But I found the link for me. And so I can say that, even personally, if William hadn't won this battle, I would not be doing this podcast with you today. It simply wouldn't exist.
So weird, isn't it?
And I hope you didn't mind indulging me for a little bit of Old English there as well. I
enjoyed it. Poem. I love listening to Old English.
It's a poem called The Wanderer. It's not anything like as famous as Beowulf, but I actually prefer it. I think it's a slightly later piece of Old English. But if you look it up, The Wanderer, there's some beautiful readings of it that you can find in the original language. So I'd encourage you to do so. So we've set the scene, and admittedly, I'm not going to spend quite so long on setting the scene with all the battles, but I wanted to set the scene for the whole episode with that story of what happened at Hastings, something I teach to my pupils every single year. But we have got this combination of a haunted abbey and a haunted battlefield on precisely the same site. And
there's a lot going on there. And I sort of feel a bit like, I understand that, William was like, oh, I feel a bit bad, actually. Like, kind of butchered a lot. A lot of people died. I don't know if building an abbey makes up for that. I'm just going to put that out there. I'm not sure that he felt that bad about it.
It's a typical aristocrat saying, well, apparently I have to do this much praying to still get into heaven. No, I'm going to pay other people to do it.
Yeah, exactly. I'll just build an abbey, and I won't build it. I'll get loads of poor labourers to do it. Fine. Easy.
Yeah. I mean, for listeners of the Poisonous Cabinet, I did a Patreon episode with them last year during the coronation of King Charles III about the succession from William the Conqueror. And he knows how bad he was, or at the very least, he's given some very charitable words on his deathbed before he literally explodes in his coffin. That's another cool story for another time, where apparently he just says, oh, I know I've done wrong by the English and God will punish me for that. And even people who otherwise, as historians at the time, write quite well of him say, no, what he did to the English was going way too far. And so there's a lot of unfinished spiritual business on this site, a lot of terrible violence, but also this crazy combination with an abbey and in fact a manor house as well. So shall we get into the first of our ghostly stories from Battle Abbey?
Let's get into it.
Some of the stories would stretch the credulity of even the most open-minded person. Folklore states that at times the altar of the abbey church would seep with blood as if still bleeding from a fresh wound. Such tales must be of some antiquity. The abbey was closed and dismantled in the 1530s on the orders of King Henry VIII, along with all other monasteries in England. Another tale speaks of the blood of the vanquished Saxon army bubbling up from the soil on rainy days. For this story, at least, there could be a rational explanation. The name of the battlefield, Senlac Hill, seems to come from the Anglo-Norman Song Lac, Blood Lake, a reference to the reddish waters of the marshland at the foot of the hill. The soil in this part of Sussex can be a reddish-brown, and anyone who witnesses the annual reenactments of the battle might attest to this, as thousands of feet churn up the soggy ground. But what of more recent reports? Battle Abbey is under the stewardship of English Heritage, and is therefore open to the public. The location of the Abbey ruins, with its southern wall built to evoke the location of the Saxon shield wall, and, pressed further back, as Harold had been, the outline of the church nave and altar, gave the visitor a sense of topography of the battlefield. Some visitors report hearing at times the sound of battle caught on the wind, or feeling a rumble through the earth akin to the charge of horses across the field. Again, skeptics might say that such rumblings may be the reverberations of cars and trains. Modern roads and railways do indeed pass nearby. However, might the eyes provide less easily refuted evidence of the paranormal? In this respect, it seems that there are three categories of apparition that are seen within the grounds of the Abbey, reflecting its varied history. These are the visions of ancient warriors, contemporary with the battle, spectres of monks in the monastic days of the site, and sightings of figures who occupied the grounds once Henry VIII had carved up the spoils in the dissolution of that monastery. Commencing with those figures who, chronologically, seem to stem from the earliest period of the site's history, the most difficult to believe are those that relate to the appearance of a figure staggering around the grounds with an arrow protruding from his eye socket on the anniversary of the battle. This, presumably, must be the spirit of the vanquished King Harold himself. Given that the sources disagree as to whether Harold really was so killed, this report seems to have more than a little convenience about it, and perhaps that doesn't warrant it so much belief. However, others may be more vague and fleeting, but perhaps therefore more credible. One such sighting was in 1971, near the Great Hall of the Manor House, established on the site after the destruction of the monastery, but still, without doubt, the site of the battle. Here, the apparition of a knight was spotted. No, not one in gleaming plate armour from a later age, but one of more modest appearance, carrying a sword and wearing a mail armour coat and a nasal helmet, typical of both armies at the battle. Could this be a victorious Norman invader, or the wandering soul of a Saxon thane, as determined in death to fulfil his oath not to be taken with weak heart and run for the battle as he had been in life? Other soldiers, some on horses, have been glimpsed between the ruined walls of the abbey, or between the trees that border the slopes of Senlac Hill, much as these trees did in 1066. Might William's brutal order to leave the Saxon dead bloodied and unburied on the battlefield for a whole year, or perhaps 10 years, depending on which source one reads, have somehow rooted many mortal souls to this place, unable to find rest for almost a millennium? Proceeding to the site's later history as a monastery, Battle Abbey has its fair share of phantom monks, spied pacing where there had once been cloisters and dormitories. The most famous of these may be seen in the dark and shadowy undercroft of the monks' dormitory, a rare and standing survivor of the original monastery. He's been seen with a book in prayer or contemplation, with some reports describing him looking up at stunned witnesses before raising a pale finger to his lips as if to demand silence. I will resist the obvious temptation to describe more of what is known as such sightings. After all, they fall much alike other stories of English churches. Instead, we shall consider the tale of a curse uttered by one of the monks in fury at the destruction of his order. The story goes that in 1538, Anthony Browne, newly owner of the dissolved abbey, was feasting in his manor hall when the door was flung open by an aged and furious monk. Before Browne's staff could remove the cowled intruder, he extended a bony finger to point in accusation at Anthony Browne, declaring that by accepting the property of the church as his own, he had doomed his line to be extinguished by both fire and water. Browne seems to have been perturbed by this declaration, but was comforted as he slipped into eternal rest on his deathbed that he had healthy sons to continue his name. However, the curse appears to have caught up with the family. In 1793, the last but one of Browne's line drowned in the River Rhine whilst on the grand tour of Europe. That very same week, hundreds of miles distant, the seat of the Browne family at Cowdray was gutted by fire. The final surviving Brownes died in 1815. How? All of them drowned in a shipwreck off Bognor on the south coast. How they dared to step foot in a boat or ship following the events of 1793 escapes me, but apparently, if a little slow to act, the old monk's curse had been fulfilled. To conclude, What English manor would be complete without the ghost of one of the ladies of the house? Battle is no exception, and perhaps has two such spirits haunting its grounds. One has been reported on several occasions, a distinctive figure solemnly pacing between the ruins of the abbey in red. A Tudor dress, perhaps. One that is less reported, but in my view rather more chilling, was recorded in a memoir of 1900 by A.J.C. Hare. He recounted the story of Lady Webster, one of the later inhabitants of the manor, who to her dying day insisted that she had the fright of her life at Battle. At the time, she slept in an old-fashioned four-poster bed. Such beds had sheets above to keep away the bugs or even birds that might have found their way into the high rafters of the room. Around the outside were heavy curtains, which afforded both privacy and insulation to the occupants of the bed. One night, while sleeping alone, Lady Webster was awoken by a sound. She peered by weak candlelight at a twitching of the curtains at the foot of her bed. She was already struck dumb in horror at the prospect of being at the mercy of an intruder at such a time of vulnerability, where the curtain was drawn suddenly aside, and there, looking in, was what was described as a terrible aspect of an older woman. She was, to the eye, solid and corporeal, with Lady Webster easily able to describe the distinctive patterns of her dress. Having scowled at the terrified Lady Webster, the woman turned and paced out of the door, striding with heavy steps down the corridor. Speaking to Sir Godfrey, head of the household, after a sleepless night, she demanded to know who this woman was, only to be assured that no such woman lived in the house, nor ever visited. And so we come to the end of our Ghosts of Battle. This site, whose history encompasses the most famous battle in English history, centuries of prayer and monastic ritual, and the turmoil of the dissolution of the monasteries and Reformation, and of course, the genteel living of the manor house, must be one of the most suitable places to be haunted in the whole of England. What might you see in the shadows should you dare to visit the site of some of England's most dramatic turning points?
There's a lot going on here, really, isn't there?
There's a huge amount. And it's only a stone's throw from you. We should go.
Yeah, we really should go. And I've got because I make notes while you're talking, right? And doodle, as I generally do. Less doodling today. And I've written altar is bleeding, blood bubbled up from the soil, rumbling, 3 apparitions. And then I've made lists of the apparitions. And then I've got doomed by fire and water. And then I wrote drowned whilst on fire, which is not how the story went, I realised.
No, the family home burnt down. That's the first thing.
So when you said he drowned, my brain finished the sentence with while he was on fire, and I was like, "Wow, what a way to go!"
That'd be doubly bad luck, wouldn't it? That would be absolutely dreadful luck. I mean, it's pretty bad to have the eldest son of the family, or the second to last son of the family, drown in the River Rhine, and then a week later the whole family home burns down, and then they calm down for a bit, and then later on, about just under 100, not even 100, sorry, about 20 years later. The rest of the family says, whatever, we'll go for a little pleasure cruise around Bognor Regis, and then, of course, their ship sinks as well. It does seem that particular curse came true. And there were plenty of stories of the abbots of these monasteries, many of whom actually had done all they could to keep Henry VIII satisfied. They'd often accepted the act of supremacy, and they'd accepted him as head of the church, maybe with crossed fingers behind their backs, but then ultimately still had their monastery sold from beneath their feet. And it's not the only story you'll find of people saying, well, if you buy or if you accept the gift of church lands, then you're going to be setting yourself up for all sorts of misfortune. But this is one of the better ones that appears to have come true.
It's a good one, and I do like a curse story, and every so often there are stories of curses that make me go, oh, that's interesting. However, I would question whether the story of the curse came after the really unfortunate events, whether it's possible that somebody went, well, no wonder they all, drowned and burned, because that's what happens when you take church land. So, but I do love a curse story. I think they're fantastic. I love the stories of altars bleeding, blood bubbled up soil. I mean, that remained a really powerful thing even up until Shakespeare's time. We see it in Richard III, that the body of the slain king is, or this, whoever he is, I can't remember which character he is, there's so many of them, is brought in, and the legend was that if you were a murderer, the body would start bleeding again in front of you and show your guilt. And I recently saw actually a production of Richard III in the Globe, and they did that on stage. So there was
amazing.
There was a body bag, a body all wrapped in cloth, and it was laid down in the middle of the stage. And then when Richard approached it, all this blood just seeped out of the body bag. And I was like, oh, to be a prop person, how much fun would you have with that? And it was brilliant. It was so well done. I loved it. It's the first time I've ever seen it like really well done on stage.
It sounds almost as good as your Richard III.
I mean, come on. I was stunning. There was less blood in mine. Actually, I think the person with the most blood in that was Dave Keane. He was the one that ended up covered in the most blood.
Yeah, that probably is fair, actually.
It's very annoying. Like, although, in fairness, I wasn't in bloody contact with anybody, so it was fine. But I do wonder. I question with these stories. When you go, like, you obviously learn in detail about the Battle of Hastings when you're in school in this country, right? And obviously, my history syllabus and curriculum was completely different in Ireland. History differs based on the country that you're in, right? I wonder how many people see knights, soldiers, etc. in places like Battle Abbey because they know the history and they're primed to see stuff like that anyway. Why am I being so skeptical today? What's wrong with me?
It seems like I'm the one who's trying to convince you otherwise, isn't it?
I know, and I've even written down the story that was recorded by AJC Hare.
Yeah,
I've written down sleep paralysis.
Yeah, it could be an example of that.
Who am I?
But what I like about that, I mean, first of all, if we just take it at face value, how terrifying is that you're in this little isolated box of curtains and then it opens and an old woman scowls at you? Absolutely. Terrifying. No, thank you. Not at all. Not tonight. Go out the room, please. I'll see you at breakfast. But she seemed actually convinced that this was a real person, not a ghost at the time. It's only afterwards when she saw there was someone else staying here. No. I don't tend to use the word heebie-jeebies, but I think that it counts in this case. I would not like that at all.
No, I wouldn't like that at all.
Could be sleep paralysis, or it was genuinely the evil and vengeful spirit of an old lady. I don't know.
I love that old ladies often are evil and vengeful spirits.
They've probably often got quite a lot to be evil and vengeful about, given the time that they lived. So
yeah.
I'm on their side, I think.
If you're living to a big age in that time period, Jesus, it just adds the list of things that you'd be seeing, You're not thinking, oh, I've got a lovely peaceful retirement. You're thinking, Jesus, I have to see more of this. Fuck's sake.
Yeah, I mean, they're still hanging around, still putting up with other people's useless rubbish. But there we go. I think it's just the image it paints in my own head of that. But we really ought to go to battle. The one that's really evocative for me, and it's because I have been several times, is the one of the monk in the Undercroft. Because it's really difficult to explain the remains there. It is essentially a ruined building, but the Undercroft survives, and you can see there are bits where there are genuine holes in the wall, and there's lots of light coming in, and the light there is genuinely interesting. And whether this explains the vision of shadows or whatever else, but I can really picture in my mind's eye a monk in one of those shadows, maybe reading or praying, and then just giving you the old shush because you're meant to be quiet in those areas of contemplation. There weren't that many places on a monastery where monks were permitted to speak under most orders. So I don't know. I think that's a very evocative image as well.
I also think that in that story, it's interesting that you described him as looking startled to see people and then going, fucking shush, like this is a place of quiet. To me, that is also evocative of like time slip kind of situation where in his time period, he's like, what the fuck? Well, he wouldn't say that because he's a monk, obviously. But he is actually seeing these people and going, I don't know what's happening, but shush, like you have to be quiet here.
The thing is a dormitory, so it would have been where people were sleeping. So you don't want to be waking up the monks.
Yeah.
They're knackered enough. They're doing a lot during the day. It's not just praying. These would have been lay brothers who were working on farms and things during the day. They've had it. They've got prayers first thing in the morning when it's still at night time. They've got another 6 rounds of prayers throughout the day. Give them a break.
And they have to work. I think people often don't think about that side of working living in a monastery or a convent that actually you're up at 5 o'clock in the morning to say your prayers and then you're working. And generally you've got, piety, chastity, and whatever else the other one is, charity. You ain't having big, lovely meals.
No, you're not.
In the midst of all this, like you're eating barely enough to survive and then laboring for the day on the farm and laboring around abouts. It's a bloody hard life.
It was, admittedly, by the end of the period of monastic history in England, there are some monasteries which are blatantly taking the piss in that regard, and they are doing quite fine, thank you very much. But actually, even that, some of that is tarnished by the propaganda of Henry VIII and Edward VI that came after.
I will also argue that, growing up in Ireland, equally,
Yeah.
there are lots of monasteries and convents where they were. We're not going to get into the ins and outs of it because I could rant about it all day. There are lots of monasteries and convents who were doing very well, and eating very well, and had lots of nice things that maybe ordinarily, with their vows of piety and charity and all of that, that maybe they shouldn't have had. So,
well, they were making very sure that they were perfectly comfortable before they did their other works.
Absolutely,
we could probably say that. Well, we do have another battle to have a look at next, and it is another English one. But I must say, Emma, before I get into this one here, I think this is the most unique story that we're going to be covering today, and I have decided to cover these battles chronologically. But I might have left this one for last if I was trying to do something which is, this is the one that is completely off the wall. Don't tune out. I still think the last one is going to be really, really interesting for people because it's the only one that doesn't take place in the British Isles. But do you know anything about the period of the English Civil War?
Oh, God, people scrapping with each other, like, that's about it. Do you know what I mean? Royalists and other people being like, listen, what are we doing here? Fighting. The end. It was bloody, it was long, it was miserable. People didn't have a good time.
Well, I strongly suspect that your Irish education would focus on the aftermath a little bit more with a certain somebody with a name beginning with C, Cromwell, who we won't talk about now. There we go. We know how you feel about him. But actually, this is a story that really only concerns the royalist side of that battle. So let's get into it. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the battle, and then we're going to get on to what I think is a genuinely remarkable ghost story attached to it. So let's go. October the 23rd, 1642. Drums reverberated across the plains as regiments of horse and foot, totaling over 30,000 soldiers, assembled, facing each other to settle a political dispute of such severity that both sides were prepared to decide the matter through a clash of arms. At the base of Edge Hill in Warwickshire, the forces of King Charles I arrayed in splendour. The king and the cause, the church and the laws, they called to rally their courage. Opposite them, south of the village of Kyneton, the Earl of Essex arranged his forces with the infantry in the centre and the cavalry to the flanks. They were inexperienced, but slightly outnumbered their royalist foes. These men fought for the rights of Parliament and wore orange sashes as a field sign in this age before regimental uniforms. This day was supposed to settle the score in an afternoon, but it was not to be. As Charles prepared to soften up Parliament's lines with his artillery, characteristically, he dithered. The delay was enough that his dashing but impetuous nephew, Prince Rupert of the Rhine, charged his cavalry at the parliamentarian left, putting the Roundhead cavalry to flight. Exuberant in what seemed to be victory, Rupert's cavalry then gave chase, ransacking and looting the parliamentarian baggage and getting richly drunk on their ale. Belatedly seizing the initiative, the king sent his entire force into the attack. Row upon row of pikemen and musketeers slowly crossed the battlefield as Parliament steeled itself for the clash. "Make ready your piece!" Musketeers blew on slow-burning matchcord and checked their priming pans for powder. "Present your piece!" Thousands of long, smooth-bore firearms were levelled at the advancing royalist regiments, and then a pause. Muskets were inaccurate at range. Still they held their fire as the drums of the cavaliers thundered the charge. Still they held. And then, "Have a care! Give fire!" Row upon untold row of guns belched forth in a rippling, deafening volley, obscuring the line with acrid white gun smoke. Thousands of heavy lead balls tore through the royalist ranks, punching holes in armour as if it was linen, shattering bones, tearing at flesh. A crazed fumbling of reloading as the army still came on until the two sides met. 16-foot-long pikes were levelled at head height and thrust at faces, arms, any area of weakness. Musketeers turned their guns about and used them to club and crush enemy skulls. At one flank, Sir Edward Varney, standard-bearer to the king, was surrounded. He fought to prevent capture of the king's colours, knowing that should the flag fall into enemy hands, it would be a huge disgrace to the king's regiments and a blow to morale. Sir Edward Varney was slain in his defence of the colours, but the flag was subsequently recaptured. The king's dispatches claimed that the severed hand of Sir Edward still gripped the flagstaff, such was the ferocity of the combat. Each side suffered grievously, and as Parliament's remaining horse and dragoons began to move around to threaten the Cavalier flanks, a curious thing happened. Panic in battle is contagious, and on this October day, the disease spread quickly and on both sides. Nobody knew what caused it, but a simultaneous fear took hold of each army, and both sides withdrew at the same time. 1,000 men lay dead. Another 3,000 lay maimed and bloodied on the floor, awaiting the women of the camp to aid them. Precisely nothing had been settled between the king and Parliament, and another 7 years of bloody civil war would engulf England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland before Charles's eventual capture and later beheading on a charge of treason in 1649. The early origins of English democracy were born in a maelstrom of bloodshed.
How interesting that they both withdrew at the same time. I forget that people can't see me and I'm doing like a withdrawal hand motion, but it's not, I mean, it's
very convincing.
Oh, thank you. I just forget that people can't see me. I've written down, my first point was that great names.
They are
great names.
Like there are some more to come as well. You'll be pleased to hear.
Like really, really, really good names, rich names, strong names. You know, big fan. And I also liked your line, panic in battle is contagious.
It really is, yeah.
Because you can imagine that you're already a fucking full fight or flight, like full adrenaline, full battle fatigue, blah, blah, blah. And then somebody starts to panic and that's it. That is it.
And
everybody's freaking out.
With the Battle of Hastings we just went over, when that dangerous rumour of William's death spread, that could have been all over for him. And one interpretation, which I quite like, that the Bretons really did retreat for real during that battle. You do wonder that had Harold ordered a full charge at that point, he probably would have won the battle, because the panic would have spread throughout all the other soldiers as well. But here, it's likely the inexperience of the parliamentarian side and the fact that the royalists feel that their flanks are being closed in by parliamentarian horse, which somewhat outnumbered them, that it just so happened that there was a panic and it spread, and then both sides end up withdrawing. Both sides absolutely claim victory. And like I say, nothing had been settled at all. And that's one of the great tragedies of the Battle of Edge Hill, is the king is feeling confident enough to chase the parliamentarians back to London. But when he gets there, he finds that the gates are shut and everyone's ready to level muskets of him. And he's got to withdraw back to Oxford and try again. And that's a great tragedy of this. I mean, if only they could have sorted it in an afternoon, then perhaps this would have been a far less seismic event. It's often said that the most deadly war in British history is the First World War. And in terms of pure numbers, that is true. But in terms of the actual percentage and proportion of the population who were slain, the English Civil War or the War of the Three Kingdoms, or whatever you want to call it, is absolutely the worst. You're talking about 1 in 5 of every man in the country killed. And that doesn't even record the women and the civilian dead. It's utterly cataclysmic.
Can I ask you a question which is slightly unrelated, but sort of related?
Certainly, I'll try and answer it.
Is it true that in battle, they would dress a number of people up as the king?
Yeah, there is some truth to that, because there's the idea of having royal decoys. But
yes, because there's a line. The reason I asked that is that when I was doing Richard III, how many times am I going to mention the fact that I played Richard III in this fucking episode? When I was doing Richard III, there is a line when he's in the Battle of Bosworth and he's just about to die, and he says, "I've slain." I can't remember how many Richmonds he says he's slain. He says, "I've killed whatever amount of Richmonds in the field tonight," because obviously, you know, Richard is portrayed as a great warrior. Blah blah blah. And I remember at the time the director telling me that was because they would have had numerous people dressed up as Richmond, so he would have thought, I've got him, and then he'd be like, oh, shit, I haven't got him. Is that true? Did that used to happen?
Yeah, it did to a certain extent, but I will say that it is something that's hugely exaggerated, and when I tell you why, it's actually really obvious: the risk of friendly fire. I mean, how easy would it be for someone to panic saying, "Oh, the king's dead, well, it's all over then," and it's actually one of the decoys. And that would bring about its own problems and its own panic. It's a bit like kids ask me all the time at work and say, "Oh, well, why didn't they just fly from their ships? Why didn't they fly the flag of their enemy?" I said, "Well, they could do that, but then when your own side finds you, it's very, very difficult to run up your own flag then and then have them believe you."
Be like, no, actually,
Yeah, it's why even to this day, despite our radar and goodness knows what else, military aircraft have a unique symbol on them which denotes which country they came from. It's that sense that there, even within the horror of war, there is a sense that you fight under your own flag. And quite here, of course, it's quite literally a flag. It is the royal standard.
Okay, thank you. I just was curious to know.
If anyone knows better than me, feel free to refute that, but that's always been my understanding. So I said that this contains a rather unique ghost story. Should we get into it?
Yes.
Visitors to the battlefield today will find it hard to experience the site as it once was. There are hedgerows where once there had been none, although the idea of battles being fought in wide open plains is in truth a Hollywood myth. But most of all, where the King's forces lined up, there is now a Ministry of Defence ammunition depot. However, the roads of 1642 are largely still there, now the minor lanes connecting isolated farms, many of which actually existed during the Civil War. Consequently, unlike other major battle sites, the indecisive Battle of Edge Hill is not a magnet for tourists. Some visitors, though, have described some commonly felt reactions to the site, a feeling of unease, hearing sounds among the hedgerows like the clash of steel or the pounding of drums. But historic sites often have an atmosphere that can play on a mind well prepared to see and hear such things. Unusually, the ghost story attached to the Kyneton fight is almost contemporary with the battle itself. On Christmas Eve 1642, several men of Warwickshire experienced something incredible at the site of the battle. There was still much unease in the area following the fight. Christmas was not a time for great celebration in 1642, and local people feared God's anger at the shedding of the blood of so many fellow Christian brothers in the recent battle. That was perhaps the most terrible thing about the Civil War, how it pit neighbour against neighbour, brother against brother, and father against son, in the fight over how England should be ruled. That December the 24th, frightened shepherds reported hearing the sounds of drums and soldiers, far off but approaching, yet they could see no glint of helmets in the moonlight, nor torches on the roads. Was one or other of the armies coming back to wreak more destruction on this corner of the kingdom? At first, the shepherds alerted Mr. William Wood, Esquire and Justice of the Peace, who then called upon Samuel Marshall, a local minister, to hear the fantastical story. The shepherds, to quote a contemporary account, gave them an account of the whole passage, and averred it upon their oaths to be true, at which affirmation of theirs, being much amazed, they should hardly have given credit to it, but would have conjectured the men to have either been mad or drunk, had they not known some of them to have been of approved integrity. And so, suspending their judgments till the next night, about the same hour, they, with the same men, and all the substantial inhabitants of that and the neighbouring parishes, drew thither. The assembled people donned their coats and headed into the night between the hours of midnight and 1 in the morning on Christmas Day, in the direction of Edge Hill. The landscape had hardly healed. The 1,000 or more dead of the fight lay in mass graves nearby, but it was known that limbs or even whole bodies were often still remaining unburied, hidden in the drains and hedges of the parish. As the men advanced down the Banbury Road, the shepherds' reports were proven to be true. The distant approach of drums was heard, as was the shouting of men and the rumble of many hoofs upon the gravelled roads. They paused, listening intently. Before long, the sound of artillery being loosed across the plain was heard, which then gave way to the roar of the charge, the thunder of the gallop, and the clash of steel on armour and pike through flesh. They were afraid, but also confused. Here appeared to be the very sound of the battle, played out again as it had been for real a few months earlier. Then, more incredible still, the sight of the combatants as apparitions on the very site of the battle. The warriors, quote, appeared in the air, the same incorporeal soldiers that made those clamours, and immediately, with ensigns displayed, drums beating, muskets going off, cannons discharged, horses neighing, which also to these men were visible, the alarum on entrance to this game of death was struck up. One army which gave the first charge having the king's colours, and the other the parliament's in their head or front of the battles, and so pell-mell to it they went. Soon the sound of the fight gave way to the groans and screams of the dying, before silence returned again. After all, the battle itself had only lasted an hour or so. The earthly spectators hurried home in fear and withdrew themselves to their houses, beseeching God to defend them from those hellish and prodigious enemies. Now, before I continue with this story, Emma, this particular ghost story happened just a few months after the actual battle. Now, what might be your skeptical explanation for that happening?
Need to shake up mealtime? Gorton Seafood has you covered with the most satisfying and convenient crunch this side of the freezer aisle. Bite into the golden crunch of their popcorn, butterfly, and southern-style shrimp. Or mix up any main course from tacos to salads with their irresistibly crispy beer-battered fillets and classic fish sticks. When it comes to easy prep, restaurant-quality flavor without the hefty price tag, nothing beats the fresh-tasting seafood Gorton's has brought to the table for 175 years. Visit Gortons.com to learn more.
Hey, true crime fans! Tired of ads interrupting your gripping investigations? Good news! With Amazon Music, you have access to the largest catalog of ad-free top podcasts included with your Prime membership. After all, ads shouldn't be the scariest thing about true crime. To start listening, download the Amazon Music app for free or go to amazon.com/ad-free true crime. That's amazon.com/ad-free true crime to catch up on the latest episodes without the ads.
Nah, not quite.
What's up?
Sell my car on Carvana. It's just not quite the right time.
Crazy coincidence. I just sold my car to Carvana.
What? I told you about it 2 days ago.
When you know, you know. You know? I'm even dropping it off at one of those sweet car vending machines and getting paid today.
That's a good deal.
Oh, great deal. Come on. What's your heart saying?
You're right. When you know...
You know.
Sold.
Whether you're looking to sell your car right now or just whenever feels right, go to Carvana.com and sell your car the convenient way. Terms and conditions apply.
Explaining football to the friend who's just there for the nachos? Hard. Tailgating from home like a pro with snacks and drinks everyone will love? An easy win. And with Instacart helping deliver the snack time MVPs to your door, you're ready for the game in as fast as 30 minutes. So you never miss a play or lose your seat on the couch or have to go head-to-head for the last chicken wing. Shop game day faves on Instacart and enjoy $0 delivery fees on your first 3 grocery orders. Offer valid for a limited time. Other fees and terms apply.
Oh God! I mean, the trauma of it. Like these people are reliving it. I don't know. That's kind of it. That would be my skeptical explanation for it happening.
Some form of mass hysteria related to the trauma of it. I mean,
yeah.
I tried to allude to this in the story, but this idea that the shepherds would be genuinely nervous watching their flocks by night. Of what if one or other of the armies comes back? This is going to be the same all over again. The devastation is wrought here. They're going to be incredibly nervous about this. Everyone's going to be keyed up about it. Now, that might seem like a really rational and very acceptable explanation now, but this isn't what I find particularly remarkable about this story. It's not just the fact that it is a story that is so close to the time of the battle. It's how the king reacts next when he hears about this story. And so as we go on, we're going to hear what King Charles thought of this. For the next week, there was no repeat of the apparitions. But that following weekend, Marshall, the minister, went out again, this time without Mr. Wood, who claimed that he had not the faith to carry him out to see such frightful things, and he refused to leave his home. Again, the battle was played out in sound and apparition with as much violence and tumult as before. At this time, King Charles had made Oxford his capital, with London surrendered to the forces of Parliament. Within a week or two, in January 1643, the rumour of ghostly fighting being played out at Edge Hill had reached the ear of the king himself. This we know, for it was, and it is, a matter of public record. Charles hastily ordered a royal commission to investigate the stories and find out if there was any merit to them. This was recorded in a report titled, "A Great Wonder in Heaven, showing the late apparitions and prodigious noises of war and battle seen on Edge Hill near Kyneton, Northamptonshire," noting that the county borders have changed since the 1640s and the site now lies in Warwickshire. Why was the king so concerned to spend time, money, and precious resources on investigating such an apparently incredible occurrence? Perhaps this is a good time to remind ourselves that in the 1600s there was not always a particular distinction drawn between what might be described as scientific, religious, or supernatural. These were all considered phenomena of God's creation, and to be understood and believed. Let us not forget that King Charles's father, James I, had written his book Demonology as a treatise on the discovery and persecution of witches, to much human misery. Perhaps, though, the best insight is given by the justification mentioned in the report by the Royal Commission, which I have quoted from already. Quote again, "It is evidently confirmed that these legions of erring angels that fell with their great master Lucifer are not confined to the local hell, but live scattered here and there, dispersed in the empty regions of the air as thick as motes in the sun. And those things which our two superstitious ancestors called elves and goblins, furies of the like, as were those who appeared in Macbeth after the King of Scotland, and foretold him of his fortunes both in life and death. It is evident, besides, that the devils can condense the air into any shape he pleaseth, as he is a subtle spirit, and rank himself in any form of likeness. Our late sovereign King James, of ever living memory, in his treatise De Demonologia, have sufficiently proved fatal ambassadors with the horror of civil and foreign wars notoriously manifested." And so the assertion was made, for not only were such apparitions real, but that the wars and conflicts of man encourage their manifestation and the work of the devil to proliferate. And Emma, can you just take a moment to appreciate the fact they've just made essentially a pop culture reference by including the reference to Macbeth in a 1640s Royal Commission?
Which I love. I love it. But then Macbeth was written for James I, right? It was a very important play at the time. All of the shit about witches in Macbeth was written because James I was obsessed with witches. And
but what I love about this is it's the equivalent of a government minister today trying to kind of relate to the ordinary folk by saying, so you know all the witches that give prophecies and stuff? Yeah, like in that playing Macbeth. Well, that's what's going on here. And I absolutely love that as a little bit of humanity to this story.
I think it's really interesting that, you know, basically the report says the devil can make shapes out of air and this is the devil's work and he's bringing up these, you know, visions of battle again, blah, blah, blah. In modern, like, paranormal zeitgeist, that conversation is still happening, but under a different hat, where people go, negativity breeds negative energy. And if you've got a really negative, I mean, I say it myself, you've got a really negative household, negative shit starts happening. And that is essentially a smaller scale of what this royal report says.
Yeah. And say, look, these demons are always here, but we are allowing them to feed on what we're doing here. And this is a punishment for all our sins. But now we're going to get into the actual findings of this Royal Commission, because the whole report you can actually find online if you look for it. You would have heard me say the full title earlier. You can for yourselves read it if you wish. And as you can imagine, I've drawn fairly heavily on it for this tale. So let's continue. With this belief, the king saw fit to send a detachment of officials to Edge Hill to investigate these claims, including Colonel Lewis Kirk, Captains Dudley and Wayman, and, quote, 3 other gentlemen of credit. On reaching Edge Hill, the men reported that on both the Saturday and the Sunday, they witnessed exactly what Wood and Marshall had reported. However, these new witnesses added an additional perspective, because these men had actually participated in the battle. Their reports attest that they were distinctly knowing diverse of the apparitions or incorporeal substances by their faces, as that of Sir Edmund Varney and others that were slain, of the which upon oath they made testimony to his majesty. Sir Edward Varney is a remarkable inclusion. He was the king's standard bearer, famously slain defending the flag. The apparitions of the Battle of Edge Hill gradually appeared with less frequency, and within a few weeks seemed to have disappeared altogether. However, as far as the official record is concerned, the apparitions of the Battle of Edge Hill were indeed very real, and that provides them with a status unique in English history. They're the only ghosts officially recognised as having existed in government records, and they remain included in the great archives of the English Royal Commission investigations. But what conclusion can we draw? That is up to each individual to decide, but the conclusion of the Royal Commission report was as follows. What does this portend? God only knows, and time will discover. But doubtlessly it is a sign of his wrath against this land for these civil wars, which he in his good time finish and send a sudden peace between his majesty and parliament. That sudden peace would come in 1649 with his majesty's beheading, further battles and upheavals, and the austerity of Cromwell's Puritan protectorate. But ultimately, this was an important step in the journey towards British parliamentary democracy. The ghosts and legacy of the Civil War remain in Parliament's bewildering and unwritten constitution, but they can be found more literally written within the archives of the Crown.
I think there's nothing to argue with here.
No.
They had a thorough scientific investigation.
The
with
experts have spoken.
Some men of standing.
Yep. 5 of them.
5 of them. They saw the thing happening. They said the thing is happening. It's the devil or God. We don't know, but it's something. And
he'll sort it out when he's ready.
Yes, and he did suddenly and swiftly and violently with a lot of head chopping. What I enjoy about this is that these men were in the battle itself.
Yeah.
And they were like, oh, we saw actual men that we knew that were we fucking saw them as apparitions.
I knew him.
I knew that guy. Like, that's crazy.
That's completely mad, isn't it? And I do love that idea that also these poor guys, if that's what they really saw, them having to relive this absolutely terrifying moment again, it can't have been a huge amount of fun, can it?
No, and I really do believe they did see it. Like, I don't for a second think they were making this up for the crack.
No,
because you've got from shepherds to, like, you know, men of standing, whatever that means, you know what I mean, who are all saying, oh shit, actually, yeah, this is happening. Is it trauma related? Is it, you know, they've just had the hideous battle that has achieved fucking nothing in the grand scheme of things?
Who's to say? But what we can say is it's printed and it's kept in the Royal Archives. It's still there and we can still read it today. And as far as I'm concerned, that's good enough for me.
Oh, I like that. That's good enough for me too.
Have you covered a story like that before? One that's actually recognised in government records?
Probably Helen Duncan.
Yeah, that's so much more recent though, isn't it?
Yes, she's 1960s. I mean, there's government records in Irish history of lots of fairy stuff.
Yeah, that's a good comparison, actually. Very
like
good comparison.
Fairy roads being moved because of fairy bushes and that kind of thing. But it's not the same as we're investigating this big battle scene that keeps playing out every night and it's freaking people out.
I love the fact that in the justification of this document, it actually says, oh, you know how we used to believe in fairies and goblins and all that stuff, but we don't really so much anymore. Yeah, but demons, they're real.
Yeah, but I love that they're like, you know, our less sophisticated people would accuse fairies and goblins of this. Sorry.
Yeah, excuse me. Yeah. Do you want to just back up a moment? Yeah, I'm half expecting that one of these 3 other gentlemen of credit that I mentioned is someone called Zachariah Bagans or something, if they're blaming all on demons. But I'm afraid I don't have a record of that. We'd have to kind of guess there.
Well, we can just assume that it was.
Yeah, let's just say it definitely was. And this is essentially a 17th century version of Ghost Adventures where they've all turned up to investigate a site and they're all screaming at what they're seeing.
Yeah, that's what I like to imagine it as too.
Good enough for me. Shall we move on to our penultimate battle?
Yes, please.
Well, we're staying in the British Isles, but we are heading up north for this one here. So let's begin. The last significant battle to be fought on British soil started with a brief exchange of artillery at extreme range and in miserable weather upon open ground astride the road to Inverness. The cannon shot either fell short or immediately dug into the sodden ground, causing few casualties. Heavy snow at 5 a.m. had turned to stinging sleet and then freezing rain. The ground, already wet, had become a mossy bog, spongy underfoot and hard to cross at speed. To the west, the forces of Charles Edward Stuart, known as Bonnie Prince Charlie, fought to put James Francis Edward Stuart, son of the deposed King James II, on the throne. Others interpret their fight also as a fight against imperialist English oppressors. To the British government troops, they were rebels, pure and simple. To their admirers, these were the gallant men of the Highland clans, the Jacobites fighting to restore who they saw as the true King of Scotland. By this soaking day on the 16th of April 1746, the Jacobites had inflicted humiliating defeats on poorly led and poorly motivated government troops. The Jacobite victory at Prestonpans in 1745 and the subsequent advance on the English fortress town of Carlisle was a huge embarrassment and an even bigger worry to the British government, who expended all expense to overhaul their command of the army, the training of their men, and even built a network of sophisticated military roads across the Highlands to confront the clans in their own backyard. The Jacobites knew that they were outnumbered and that they could not compete with government forces on equal terms, with the British Army also supported by the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. When they had been most successful, it was through surprise, daring, and sheer guts. It was under these conditions that they developed the Highland Charge. This was as simple as it was brave. The Highland warriors, resplendent in tartan and plaid, would mount a sudden frontal assault. As they charged, they would roar, run, and whirl claymore swords and brandish dirk daggers at their foes. Performed successfully, the Redcoats had only time for 1 or 2 panicked volleys of fire before the Jacobites fell upon them, parrying bayonets with small tarred shields on the left arm and hacking them to pieces. This took advantage of the lack of flexibility and initiative drummed into government infantry in the name of discipline, or otherwise putting them to flight with the violence of their charge. As the Jacobites crossed the boggy ground at the Culloden estate in April 1746, they hoped that this would be one last chance to perform another brave charge and defeat the government forces once and for all. Their advance was hampered by the ground and the weather, and by the challenge of coordinating their attack over a wide and uneven line of battle. But with one mighty roar, the Jacobites whirled their claymores and fell upon the red-coated line infantry. But the Duke of Cumberland, commander of the government army, had prepared his men well. With clockwork precision, they fixed socketed bayonets to their muskets, allowing their guns to serve as spears too. They lowered their weapons at the onrushing Jacobite mass, and they fired. Lead shot ripped through tartan and flesh, and the Hanoverian cannon shot obliterated bone and body. But still, the Highlanders charged. Then the next rank fired, while the first reloaded. As the range closed, each volley became more devastating. But still, the Jacobites hurled themselves at the thin red lines of infantry. But Cumberland had one more deadly surprise for the men that he saw as rebels. As the first lines of Jacobites met the government troops, they were to parry the bayonets, only to see them swoop aside. Now discipline and training paid off. The government troops had been drilled to thrust their bayonets to the right and not to the man facing them. This bypassed the protection of the small tarred shields, and the Highland charge broke like a stricken ship on jagged rocks. Cumberland ruthlessly, even cruelly, ordered the clubbing and bayoneting of wounded Jacobites as his army advanced to counter the charge. In the rout that followed, as many as 2,000 Highlanders were killed, wounded, or captured. Government forces lost only 50 killed. The dead were buried under cairns on the battlefield that still stand in silent memorial to the doomed Jacobite rising, making Culloden a poignant and ominous place, a battle mourned by many Scots, and, to be honest, little celebrated by many English or other British people. The national politics at play here remains complex, raw, and sensitive to this very day. So this is all about the Battle of Culloden.
Of course, it remains raw and sensitive to this day, but also the wild bravery of that Highland charge.
Yeah.
You're running to your death. You are running into your death, and you are saying the sheer force of speed and brutality that we are bringing with this, and the element of surprise. Like, some of us are going to die, but we're going to take you out. And there's a real kind of, when you look at, the old ways of Celtic battles, Irish warriors used to go into battle naked, famously, and they'd go in screaming naked. These big men, these big wild men running into battle, and the whole thing was, we're going to fuck them up. We're going to mess with their heads. We're going to surprise them. We're going to shock them. They're not going to know what to do, and that moment of shock will give us an element of surprise, that bit of advantage. And the Highland charge seems to be quite a similar way of thinking.
There's bound to be some mythology here, because I think what we really realise is that although there would be certain truth to what I've described here, a lot of it would just have been that horrible brawl that we've described before. But I think there's that deliberate contrast in the story, isn't there, between the very individualistic and raw bravery of the Highland charge combined with the very mechanical bayonet actions of the government forces, very reflective of the machines that are emerging at this time of the Industrial Revolution, of instead of thrusting forward with a bayonet only to get parried by this small shield, but to instead thrust very rhythmically to the right to get the man who isn't covered by that shield. It's a huge contrast, and I'm sure that there's a certain amount of license being taken with that. But what we can be certain of is that roughly this number of men died. Yes, there would have been other government wounded who would have died from infections and disease and goodness knows what else in the interim. But this is recent enough that we can actually start to treat some of these figures with a certain amount of trust, which we can't always do with earlier figures.
When did you say it was? 1700s?
So yeah, 1746, April
Right.
1746. So looking at about 2,000 Highlanders killed to less than 100 of the government forces. So it's a very uneven result.
The way that the government soldiers were trained, they weren't very good at being flexible, right?
No.
But then when they had figured out a weakness, they went with that weakness and
It's essentially they've managed to counter their enemy's weakness.
capitalize on it. That's
Yeah.
the word I was trying to get to. I had a point there and I've forgotten what the point is. It'll come back to me.
just shout above me as we're going through the ghost stories. But I think that
Stop what you're saying.
in terms of the context, though, I think this is still a place that is it is felt very keenly as a very painful place, especially for a lot of Scots. And I know Scottish friends who've been here, and they've treated it very much as a pilgrimage. And I think, yeah, I can totally understand that. It's not something that I can relate to personally with my own nationality, but I have been to these sorts of sites and felt their atmosphere. And so, again, you might argue that this is something that is primed into people. But I think some of the stories here are a little bit different from the ones we've had a look at so far, but they do have that sense of the sadness of the site and the loss of the site, and perhaps they reflect that terrible weather that they had that day as well. So let's get into the hauntings. At the risk of revisiting similar occurrences, yes, Culloden is said to pay host to some stone tape-like repetition of events on the anniversary of the battle. Descriptions of the sounds of battle and the cries of the wounded are reported by many visitors to the site to this day. Perhaps this is well expressed by American author Diana Gabaldon, whose Outlander series of novels focuses on the Jacobite Rising. She says, "I've walked a lot of battlefields. Most are not haunted. That one is. Without being metaphysical at all, I can feel the people there. I can't talk about them or I'll cry. You develop a sense of emotional attachment to the people and the places that you write about." The open ground is curiously devoid of birdsong. This is something that I've experienced myself at historic sites of great tragedy, and it is jarring to an unusual degree. One fails to appreciate how ubiquitous the sound of birds can be outside until their song is suddenly silenced. One unusual manifestation that has been reported is the mist. The valleys and plains around Inverness are no strangers to inclement weather, as was proved by the conditions on the day of the battle. However, visitors describe a ghostly and unnatural mist springing up from the site in imitation of the Jacobite lines, and then sweeping eastwards and wheeling round from the north, exactly as the Highland charge had done with such fatal consequences. Natural weather or an echo of the past? Well, it's up to the individual to decide. The aforementioned author, Gabaldon, was not the only person to have personal experience of the paranormal at the site. One woman who visited in 1936 wrote about finding a large tartan plaid draped over one of the cairns, marking the mass graves. Leaving tartan cloth, flowers, or other tokens is not unusual on the site, but on lifting this plaid, she was horrified to see the apparition of the mortally wounded Highlander, silently seeming to gasp for air before disappearing before her eyes. A more commonly reported spirit concerns the apparition of a dejected and traumatized Highlander. He is described as unusually tall, with gaunt and drawn figures. He wanders the battlefield, mumbling the word "defeated" as he goes, apparently ignoring or unaware of modern visitors around him. Other visitors describe curious anomalies related to their visits. Clocks and watches cease to tick on arrival at the battlefield, only to resume once their owners leave. Perhaps the most common report, though, is people feeling overwhelming sadness at this site. Naturally, such a bleak place with a moving history might evoke these feelings for very natural reasons. But others would insist that the supernatural is also at play, with people who have no personal connection to the site nevertheless feeling the desolation of those who fought and died there. Culloden all but destroyed the system of the Highland clans that had long been at odds with English-dominated government. What government bullets and bayonets had physically destroyed in battle would be further erased by Acts of Parliament banning the military traditions of the Highlands, banning tartans, and even banning bagpipes, considering them to be literally instruments of war. Culloden reminds us that today's divisions over politics and national identity have deep roots. Perhaps it should remind us of the importance of settling differences peacefully and democratically, rather than paying in blood. Whatever lurks at Culloden, the memory of the battle casts a long shadow, indeed.
I feel like the overwhelming feeling of sadness is, even when people are like, I've got no personal connection to this battle site. If you know what happened here
Yeah.
and you physically go to that place, your brain is going to go, oh, fuck. Like, all these men died here. These men were fighting for their land. They were fighting, tooth and nail, fighting with their lives. You are going to feel something. And the bird song, the bird song thing is interesting because they say the same thing about Auschwitz, that there's no that birds don't sing over Auschwitz, and it's I think that's a very human thing to say, isn't it? That even nature is devastated by what happened here.
Have you been to Auschwitz?
Yes, twice.
Yeah, I've been twice as well. I've taken students there as well. I first experienced this phenomenon, though, at a different concentration camp. I was at Sachsenhausen outside of Berlin. I was 17. The difference I remember with Sachsenhausen is it wasn't for a lack of trees. It wasn't as if there weren't any perches for those birds to go. It was just that sense that there was this unnerving stillness to the place. It felt very figuratively dead, as well as connected literally to death. And I remember that I found that very affecting as a sort of an older teenager, having got good understanding of the factual history, but not a particularly good emotional understanding of the weight of the past and what it can have on you. I
don't think, though, I have to say, I don't think you can really understand the emotional weight of it.
No.
Until you are in somewhere like that. Like, I took kids to Auschwitz as well. So I went with my friend the first time I went, and remember we were in Poland, and we were like, oh, we'll book a trip to Auschwitz, and the hotel receptionist was like, oh, leave that until the end of your trip, because it will ruin the rest of your trip. And kind of intellectually, all of the information, but it's when you get there and you physically see it and you go, oh my God. I'm standing here, like, this is where it happened.
But you feel your emotions getting really brittle as well. Like, I found myself getting really oversensitively annoyed at various things going on, the people that I interpreted as maybe just being even slightly disrespectful. I just wanted to, I think it's almost the teacher in me just coming out and just saying, I want to go over and say, do you really think you want to be taking a photograph of yourselves in front of that? One for the family album, and get a grip. I mean, if you must take a photograph to show other people that you've been here, fair enough. But having a bloody selfie in front of this site like this, get a grip. And I'm not going to name him, but because I've not got any permission of this, but a friend of mine who he's someone I know who's from Edinburgh, and he's just one of the greatest blokes you ever meet. He's a fantastically proud Scotsman. I remember I met him once visiting a friend up in Glasgow, all things, but we met halfway between Glasgow and Edinburgh, and it was during the Rugby World Cup, and he's very keen on the idea of Scottish independence. He has visited Culloden almost like a pilgrimage, like I say. And I remember the photographs he took of that were incredibly respectful. They're very tasteful, and they were a document of his visit. They were nothing touristy about them. And the way he wrote about it and the way he felt about it I found it very, very moving, because that for me kind of transcends national boundaries. But then when I went and visited him during the Rugby World Cup, he was there wearing his Scotland rugby shirt, and I was there in Scotland wearing my England one before the game.
Oh.
And he just said to me, right, do you want to swap shirts? And I went, I'm happy to. I think the blue will look really good on me. But will your friends ever speak to you again? I don't know. I'll risk it. And there we were, middle of the pub. We swapped shirts. We had a couple of photographs taken. We had a really good laugh about it. And then one of his mates walked in, looked up, walked out, came back in, looked again, shook his head, and then left for a good 10 minutes at this sort of shock of it. And although today we can kind of laugh about those rivalries, which have been kind of distilled down in that sense to a fiercely contested sports match, underneath that, there's a real weight to history. And I think that if there really are long-lasting ghosts of the Battle of Culloden and that feeling of sadness and regret, it's seen in those sorts of moments, and hopefully that's also a sign that people who are from different backgrounds, we can still have those moments of togetherness and fun and a sense of friendship, which is so important, isn't it?
Yes, it is, most definitely. Although I have to say, even being half English, I don't think I'd wear an England jersey.
This is always the way, isn't it? Always the way. We swapped back later. Oh, I really wanted to keep the Scotland one. I thought it was a much better trip.
The Scotland jersey is a lovely jersey.
Really good. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was told it suited me a great deal, but then I just opened my mouth and ruined it for anyone who was listening. Anyway, we should go on to, I think, at long last, our final battlefield. And this time we're going to be leaving the shores of the British Isles for somewhere that I think will be very much the most requested battlefield if people were to vote on it. So she'll get into it.
This is the battlefield that people have been like, please, for the love of God.
This is the one that people have been waiting for, isn't it?
Yeah.
All right. I hope they're not disappointed. I hope, as an Englishman, I can do this justice. So far, we have looked at 2 British conflicts that were civil wars, part of the long and transformational history of these islands. War is so awful that it can scarcely help but be a turning point in the national experience. In the United States, to keep the context terribly brief, the foundational sin of the enslavement of black people by a white oligarchy was never settled by the Founding Fathers. Instead, the titanic clash between the Union and the Confederacy would be a bloody and tragic means of firstly preserving the Union, but also of freeing, at least in theory, enslaved people throughout the United States. There is no time here to discuss the intricacies of the American Civil War, a topic which might occupy an entire history podcast. But aside from the inherent awfulness of this war between the states, other factors made it more so. The American Civil War was perhaps the first truly industrialized war. Armies were moved and supplied by railroads, particularly on the Union side. Weapons of great accuracy were mass-produced, killing with both brutality and precision. Tactics, little changed from the Napoleonic age of volley fire and frontal assaults, came up against long-range, accurate rifles and more rapid-firing guns. And yet, the resulting wounded, maimed by expanding Minié balls, could not be treated with antibiotics, and rarely with anaesthetics. In a development that will have echoes with the paranormal aspects we will investigate, the war, while not the first to be photographed, that dubious honour going to the Crimean War a decade before, it was the first to be widely photographed, including graphic images of the aftermath of battle. The population was also increasingly literate, providing an insight into the personal experiences of the combatants, as well as the motivations of the commanders and an understanding of the wide sweep of strategy. When, on July the 1st, 1863, the Union's Army of the Potomac met with the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia outside Gettysburg for 3 days of horrifying combat, the result would not end the war, but it would decide its result. The Union forces occupied a ridge of high ground facing the west and creating a fishhook-shaped formation on the top, difficult to outflank at its northern end, and, it was hoped, defended by steeper and more rocky ground in the hills at Little Round Top to the south. Robert E. Lee's rebel regiments attacked from the west, hoping to destroy the Union Army and force Lincoln's government into at least entering negotiations favourable to the Confederate cause. It was Lee's Confederate Army that would be defeated. I will not attempt to explain why in full here, but I will only illustrate 2 key moments where the secessionist attack failed to break the northern lines. On the second day of the battle, determined attempts to dislodge the men holding the southern flank of the Union line reached a climax. By the afternoon, the 20th Maine Volunteer Infantry had repulsed repeated Confederate attacks. For the Union, the stakes could not have been higher. Losing the heights at Little Round Top will result in the crumbling of the Union left, and would have granted Lee a commanding position over the battlefield. Like boxers between rounds catching their breath, neither side could be sure how exhausted their opponent was. But Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain's outnumbered Maine troops knew that each man was down to his last 1 or 2 cartridges. Chamberlain felt little choice but to roll the dice one last time. Up went the call. Fix! At that first word came the rattle of men grabbing the sockets of their bayonets! And on that second word, the deadly sharp implements were affixed with a series of staccato clunks to the ends of their rifles. With the equally exhausted Confederates advancing, Chamberlain's volunteers charged down the wooded hills, swinging like a great door to hit their enemies from the front and side simultaneously. The Confederate bluff had been called. Those who did not flee either fell in hand-to-hand combat or were taken prisoner. The southern flank was secure. The second incident concerns the third day, and a moment that historians have struggled to explain ever since. Robert E. Lee, up to this point one of the most respected commanders on either side, seemed to commit a terrible and inexplicable blunder. He sent the greater part of his army to attack the centre of the Union line, across over half a mile of open ground, under the sights of Union artillery and prepared rows of riflemen behind cover. Pickett's charge was celebrated by apologists for the Confederate cause as a brave and noble failure. Indeed, there was courage shown that day as cannon shells tore through the ranks and deadly volleys of rifle fire scythed down row upon row of Confederate soldiers. However, modern interpretations see it for the blunder it was. Along with the 1,000 of Lee's men who died, also perished the Confederate cause, with the extent of their advance sometimes rather simplistically referred to as the high watermark of the Confederacy. This might serve to illustrate one of the problems of the paranormal investigation of battlefield sites. They are so frequently shrouded in myth and legend before one even considers the ghostly aspect. The battlefield at Gettysburg, now a national park, is less preserved in aspect than it is a 1930s interpretation of events and positions. Added to this, the undeniably moving words of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address of November 1863, while dedicating the military cemetery, serves to heighten the near sacred status of the landscape itself. One of the shortest but most important speeches ever given in the English language. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives, that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But, in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work, which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honoured dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they here gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. With due apologies to Abraham Lincoln for how I mangled that. If the available sources are anything to go by, the battlefield of Gettysburg is one of the most haunted sites anywhere in the United States. Any first reactions, Emma?
No immediate reaction, aside from A, bloody and brutal, as they all have been, and B, very well told.
Thank you very much.
And kind of reinforced for me why I'm glad I did not tell it.
I must say, given that this is American history, and it's American history which is so very personally and deeply held by so many people, you can probably hear that I was absolutely walking on eggshells with some of those things. But some of the things I hope I did also communicate is the unequivocal wrong of slavery, and the fact that actually the idea that the Civil War was just about ending slavery is not really true. It's about the preservation of the Union as well. The fact that it also ended slavery, but of course, very sadly, not the terrible discrimination. That is more my interpretation, but it is one that I happen to hold very much to heart, even as an Englishman. Without doubt, I make no sort of allowances or apologies for the ideology that supported slavery, but I simultaneously, and within the same mind, can recognise the bravery of those who fought there on both sides. I don't think that acknowledging that is making an apology for the cause for which they fought. It's a recognition of what they did. And I think as well, I know it might seem a bit indulgent to include the whole of the Gettysburg Address, but I think when you're thinking about the atmosphere of the battlefield and the idea that there are cemeteries there and that this place is like the meeting point for the culmination of America's foundational stories, what an incredibly moving, and frankly perfect few words in order to try and express that feeling. And the irony of him saying, though, people will not remember what we said here, but they have, because what he said there that day in those short few words, which were noted down, but of course not recorded, they really are remarkable, aren't they? And I do find that a very moving piece of oratory, whatever you think of its content. But that aside, shall we get into some ghosts?
Absolutely.
Perhaps the number of sightings of paranormal phenomenon isn't surprising. At present, the park has been expanded to over 6,000 acres, and it receives over 1 million visitors per year. Consequently, there are many sites to explore, many crucial areas where fighting took place, and no shortage of potential witnesses to the strange and the unexplained. One of the key hotspots for paranormal sightings is related to the action at Little Round Top at the southern extent of the Union Lines. Atop the hill is a group of rocky outcrops and boulders referred to as the Devil's Den. This is a naturally disorienting landscape with the possibility of shadows and objects flitting quickly between the rocks, and the initial sightings at the Devil's Den date back to the 1880s and the first founding of the Memorial Park. In the battle, there was fierce fighting here, and it had been repeatedly used by Confederate sharpshooters to snipe at Union's officers. Even today, visitors report seeing soldiers moving about in the rocks, slipping away when sighted, much as a sniper would do. Others step inside the rocks and hear the faint echoes of shouts, bugle blasts and gunfire. A running theme is the number of photographs purporting to show ghosts at Gettysburg. Certainly, taking photos in such a location is entirely natural and explicable. But as ever, opinions on the veracity of this photographic evidence is a matter of personal opinion, with the photos usually being indistinct smudges, mists, and movements on film. Perhaps more convincing evidence will be on the way as the number of cameras on site continues to grow. Another famous and repeated sighting is the so-called Phantom Regiment. This has been seen at several locations, so it is unclear if this represents one phantom unit moving around or many similar apparitions. This takes the form of a typical stone tape phenomenon. Sometimes it involves just the sound of marching boots or shouting voices, but others have reported seeing the soldiers marching in ranks towards the battlefield. However, sightings seem to agree on two details. The Phantom Regiment appears to be a Confederate unit, and while their marching appears well-ordered and disciplined, their uniforms appear ragged and non-standard. The history of the Civil War would actually lend credence to this. Smart grey uniforms, synonymous with the many depictions of Confederate forces, were increasingly rare for the rank and file of soldiers by 1863, as the economic and logistical challenges of the Union blockade began to bite. Civilian clothing made roughly the right colour or tattered uniforms in need of replacement were commonplace. Contemporary photographs seem to confirm this. The question might be, are the sightings a true replaying of past events? Or are witnesses seeing an accurate image based on photographs they have subconsciously committed to mind? As ever, it is a matter of belief. An unusual feature of Gettysburg ghost sightings, at least compared to other haunted battlefields, is the number of female apparitions reported. Historic warfare has generally been patriarchal and male-dominated. Women have always had a crucial role to play, but being present during the fighting was unusual. However, until about the time of the Civil War, it was not at all unusual for women to accompany the army in support roles. A practice only just dying out by the 1860s as military logistics became more centralised and industrialised. Women were often some of the first searching through the dead and wounded at the end of the battle. Don't forget that had been the case at Hastings in 1066, and it was to an extent the case at Gettysburg 800 years later. One curious occurrence concerns the area referred to as the Grove. This was near the northern end of the Union line, and it came under repeated assault by a unit called the Louisiana Tigers, reputedly recruited from the mean streets of New Orleans, including its jails. The fighting and artillery fire here resulted in many of the victims being buried together in unmarked mass graves, anonymous and known only to God. As visitors to the park increased in number during the 20th century, access needed to be improved, and in the centenary year of the battle, 1963, a new road was constructed through the grove. This accidentally unearthed human remains. Although pains were taken to treat these with due dignity, since then the area has been a hotspot for shadows, mists, and sightings of soldiers among the trees. More surprisingly, though, are repeated sightings of a young woman or girl. One story suggests that she was traumatized by the battle and ended up taking her own life. Tragic if so, but the sources to support this are very patchy at best, and do seem rather to reflect a common and morbid narrative for such spirits. Perhaps as likely might be that she was one of the women who searched among the victims of the battle, tending to the wounded, collecting items of value, and laying the dead to rest. A similar spectre has been reported at other grave sites, a woman in a flowing white dress searching in vain among the graves, for whom we can never know. Another famous spectre is that of Virginia Jenny Wade, not to be mistaken for the famous tennis champion, you understand. At 8 a.m. on the last day of the battle, Jenny Wade was at home, kneading dough in her kitchen when tragedy struck. A stray rifle bullet from the battle smashed through the door of her house and struck her, killing her instantly. She was only 20 years old, and she is the only recorded civilian casualty of the battle, or at least the most famous. The house is now a museum, recreating a typical house of the 1860s. As is common in such circumstances, reports vary from hearing Jenny's voice to seeing her in rooms and corridors. The house was subject to a paranormal investigation in 2010 on the TV show Ghost Adventures, and again in 2014 for Ghost Hunters. I've been unable to find details for what, if anything, these investigations uncovered, but the house maintains a spooky reputation. However, whatever the reports of hauntings, the story of Jenny Wade is a real-life tragedy. It has, though, a unique epilogue. The dough kneaded by Jenny Wade, once proved, was baked by her mother, and the next morning it was used to feed Union soldiers. As such, perhaps symbolically, the federal government granted Wade's mother a war pension, considering Jenny Wade's unfortunate demise to have been sustained in the course of her noble duties to feed those fighting to preserve the Union. There are so many stories of ghosts in and around Gettysburg that I cannot possibly cover them all. But by way of conclusion, I will finish with one rather unlike the others. The Gettysburg College was established in 1837, so had been a feature of the community for about a generation by the time of the battle. One sighting concerns the odd appearance of a Confederate lookout in the bell tower. Unlike other spirits reported in the area, he seems to be well aware of the people looking at him, and he gestures to them urgently, but silently, as if trying to communicate a warning. One of the dormitory buildings was hastily adapted into a Confederate field hospital during the battle. A grisly and famous aspect of medical care in the Civil War was surgery. The Minié balls, fired by muzzle-loaded guns of the era, cleverly expanded in the barrel of the guns. This allowed them to be loaded easily, but still grip the rifling of the barrel. Their shape was aerodynamic, their spinning flight more accurate, and their velocity far higher than earlier bullets. Their mass was also many times the mass of modern bullets. The result was that even non-fatal wounds caused catastrophic shattering of bones, regularly leading to amputations. The science of infection was in its absolute infancy in the 1860s, and so surgeons had to be very diligent in the removal of all the infecting debris from suppurating wounds as they worked. A famous, though one-off story concerns two security guards working late at the dormitory of the college. They had taken a staff utility lift to an upper floor and were travelling down when the elevator stopped. The doors slid open, and before them, not as a misty apparition, but in full, gory detail, was the managed chaos of the Confederate operating theatre, with patients writhing in agony, blood and bandages over the floors and furniture, and exhausted surgeons fighting to save lives. The door closed again, and nobody has ever witnessed this since. Perhaps as perplexing as anything, this scene of chaos and pain was completely without sound, as if the men had been peering through soundproof glass as unseen spectators to the scene. Perhaps, and I do love these sorts of stories, rather than an apparition, this might actually be described as a time slip. Whatever the case, it seems that a visit to the battlefield at Gettysburg is a profound experience and a way of understanding America's troubled and imperfect growth into the world's leading democracy. And so to conclude our battlefield stories, we have looked at just 4 famous battlefields that allegedly preserve the echoes of the horrors that occurred there. If supernatural experiences are somehow fueled by strong emotions and powerful energy, then they are natural candidates for the supernatural. But they are also places of very earthly trauma, mourning, and historical significance that, as in some cases I can personally attest, have the power to deeply affect those of us who visit them, seek to understand them, and walk in the footsteps of those who fought, feared, and bled on them. It is said that only the dead have seen the end of war, but in these cases, it seems that some of the departed remained doomed to keep on fighting.
Oh, gorgeous. Very poetic end. I enjoyed that. Well done. Well
Thank you very
written.
much.
I am going to let you know, as the listener, that, I mean, huge swathes of this will be cut out, but it has been chaos trying to get this done.
It really has. I've done my best.
It has been chaos. It's been hilarious. We could sit here and argue about people being primed to see these things when they go to Gettysburg, etc., etc. I think there is a real importance in people remembering what happened at these battle sites, remembering how horrific it was, and if that comes in the form of people seeing apparitions, and then maybe, I don't know, trying to figure out who it was, digging deeper into the stories of these battlefields, then that's good enough for me. Yeah. I don't need to try and logic it away and be like, is it this? Is it that? I did love the story about the guys seeing the surgical room. Like,
who doesn't love a time
great
slip?
Story. I remember watching a documentary years ago about one of those kind of medical hospitals during Gettysburg. Like, it was horrific.
I mean, I've taught about this. I mean, for a time I taught about the history of warfare to sort of older teenagers who kind of are better able to cope with some of the more realistic details. And the wounds produced by these weapons, they were so horrific. I mean, they are, as bullet wounds, they're far worse than anything you get today, even unless it was a very high caliber round, because these are it's the infancy of this sort of fighting, and tactics and people's understanding of warfare hadn't quite adapted to the technology yet. And you find this repeatedly, that tactics and people's reactions to it and the numbers of dead, they seem to sometimes be out of step with each other.
Yeah.
You see that in the First World War. You see it to a certain extent in the Second World War. But with the American Civil War, you absolutely do see it. They hadn't yet worked out a way of having the sheer weight of men that you needed to arrive at one point, to arrive at that point in an orderly fashion, whilst not taking unacceptably high losses from the high velocity rifles of the day. And it's that point, as well as all the other things, that I find particularly chilling about learning about the American Civil War. I do find it fascinating. I do try and keep myself well informed about it, despite the fact that it's not part of my own historical background and cultural heritage. And I see it as this, perhaps I often feel, not particularly well-healed wound in American society, perhaps even to this day. But hey, that's all the more reason to remember it. And if people are seeing ghosts, be they real, be they imagined, I can totally understand that. And I've got no doubt whatsoever that these people are experiencing what they are experiencing.
If you are listening to this and this is kind of your first time deep diving into ghosts of the Gettysburg battlefield, I can highly recommend, like, genuinely go look up the pictures and videos of ghosts and stuff that people have taken in Gettysburg. Like, some of them are really interesting. Like, they're not necessarily like, you know, full scale battles that you're seeing, but a lot of the pictures and videos are, you know, some of them are shite, obviously, because they always are.
Yeah. But some are quite compelling as well, aren't they?
Some are interesting, yeah.
You've got to say, well, hang on, that is a lot more compelling than 90% of the similar videos that I've seen. And I'm sure that there are listeners who know so much more about, both the battle possibly, but particularly the ghost sightings at Gettysburg, will be saying, oh, why didn't you include this one and why didn't you include that one? I mean, I could easily have done a whole episode just on Gettysburg, and that is fair enough. I just wanted to give a sense for just one or two moments of something that is just a gigantic event, and of which there are so many stories. So go ahead, read ahead, find out what you can, and really enjoy that journey, because it is fascinating, and I really enjoyed researching these stories.
Tim, is this our longest episode to date?
That could well be. I mean, maybe this should have been 2 as well. I really don't know. Hopefully people don't mind. The thing is, I've had such a long week. I've had a couple of incredibly long days. That's why it's been chaos for us, because occasionally I'm talking about seeing goats on the battlefield rather than ghosts, and then completely collapsing in pieces.
Tim, you will be glad that this is your final input for 31 Days of Terror, because now you can actually relax a little bit. I massively appreciate you coming on and all the research that you've done and the writing that you've done for these stories. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm sure the listeners have thoroughly enjoyed it. If there's any factual inaccuracies, don't bother sending them to me, because I send them to Tim.
And if you send them to me, I've got enough marking to do. I can't promise not to ignore them.
Tim, it's been a pleasure. Where can people find you?
Well, at the moment, in an absolute heap in my seat somewhere in Devon. But if they want to find me online, I've got a social media presence in terms of my Instagram, which is Dry Wipe History, where you can find various whiteboard pictures of historical events that I draw on my school whiteboard. And in particular, on my YouTube channel, which is called Mr. Cloke History. And I'm told it makes quite a good podcast of its own, even though it's talking about revision topics and things for British school kids. A wide variety of topics on there, including world history, US history. And if you'd like to subscribe to the channel, it'll really help the algorithm. Because without sounding like I'm begging too much, after the exams finish, I get a real drop off, and I know that the YouTube algorithm will punish you for that. So any support that you can give the channel would be deeply, deeply appreciated. And just one last thing, Emma. Yes, I'm tired. Yes, at times I've stumbled over my words today, but I have absolutely loved every second of doing these 4 episodes. You know how much I enjoy it. I wouldn't do it if I didn't love it. So I'm, from the bottom of my heart, thanks so much for having me on. And thanks to all of your listeners for being so welcoming towards me. Thank you very much.
Tim, it's been an absolute pleasure, and I shall see you next time.
See you soon. Cheers, dears.
The new Boost Mobile network is offering unlimited talk, text, and data for just $25 a month for life.
That sounds like a threat.
Then how do you think we should say it?
Unlimited talk, text, and data for just $25 a month for the rest of your life?
I don't know.
Until your ultimate demise.
What if we just say forever?
Okay.
$25 a month, forever.
Get unlimited talk, text, and data for just $25 a month with Boost Mobile forever.
After 30 gigabytes, customers may experience slower speeds. Customers will pay $25 a month as long as they remain active on the Boost Unlimited plan.
An unusual feature of Gettysburg ghost sightings. Goat sightings? What the fuck am I? We are both of us losing our minds now.
That's the best thing you've said all day. Gettysburg goat sightings. That would be the name of this episode if it had a name. Not me.
I've got about a page left. All right, let's go.
We can do this.